if let's take a 50,000 foot view or 30,000 foot, whatever the saying is. I mean, what's your outlook right now as someone who's, worked at these companies and now you're kind of looking at it from the outside? Like, what does the state of the food delivery industry look like to you right now we're at the beginning of 2021? What are the things that you're thinking about in regards to food delivery and, kind of right now and going forward?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting time.
Hmm.
If you look at the U.S. and Canada, these businesses have been operating for quite a few years now. Grubhub's been around for a while, and so you're starting to reach, I think, a different stage in the maturity cycle. The last couple of years were really focused on, foundational building blocks for marketplace businesses. So making
Hmm.
sure we have enough restaurants when you open the app, it's a good experience. Making sure we have enough drivers that you're not the food isn't sitting on the counter table cold.
Yeah.
Making sure we have enough consumers to make sure that restaurants and drivers are kept busy. So I would say that was sort of chapter one. And so I think
Hmm.
we're entering chapter two now, where a lot of cities and towns in the US and Canada have delivery services. They're pretty good, they're pretty consistent across the platforms. And now what's next is probably two things, particularly with DoorDash IPOing. I think there'll be a greater sort of focus from investors on improving profitability. Again, all of these platforms have been losing quite a bit of money to
Yeah.
sort of scale and build up these businesses. It's not cheap to create a food delivery service, right? There's a reason
Hmm.
why these things didn't exist in the past.
What's the
Um,
expensive part of creating a food delivery business, or the most expensive part?
so you'd be surprised, right? So hiring engineers is not cheap.
Hmm.
And so talent is expensive in San
Yep.
Francisco. If you want to build a app that is responsive, that never crashes, that works all the
Add new
time,
features,
add new
products. Yeah.
features, et cetera, and improve the experience for customers and drivers and restaurants. Getting the word out about your service. So spending dollars to acquire customers on behalf of restaurants and
Hmm.
drivers so that you can get those people to spend and generate deliveries and trips that,
Yeah.
then passes back to the driver and restaurant.
I mean, Ubereats
Um,
just spent what, $7 million on a Super Bowl commercial, right?
exactly. I forget the exact amount, but it wasn't cheap, right? Those things
Yeah.
are expensive.
Okay.
But those are things. Those are table stakes to a certain extent, because you got to be able to
Got it.
generate demand for your restaurants and drivers. Ultimately,
Yep.
that's what they're really looking for, right? They want
Hmm.
deliveries and they want orders. And I would say the third piece is just operating the market from a day-to-day place. So many people don't realize this, but Uber takes care of the customer service for restaurants for the most
Yeah.
part. That's part of the service. So they have large call centers with hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are answering the phone. Those
Yeah.
are real people who get paid. That costs a lot of money, right? And so there's
Yep.
all sorts of expenses that customers don't really see. It's in the back end,
Right.
but all sorts of expenses that are required and will get cheaper over time, but they're expensive to build out initially.
Got
So
it.
I think number one, you'll see greater focus on profitability from investors as these businesses mature. And number two, I think they'll start to think about, okay, what's next? And so these are all growth companies. They got to constantly be thinking about over the next 2, 3, 4, 5
Mm.
years, what is the next Uber Eats, right? What is the next food delivery? And you're starting to see that a little bit. Uber recently acquired Drizzly, which is alcohol marketplace in the U.S.
Yep.
You're seeing DoorDash move aggressively into convenience. Uber also acquired Corner Shop, the grocery app. And so you're already starting to see these platforms think about, now that I have a really solid base of drivers and customers, what other services or products can I sell to them to continue that growth over the next couple of years?
Yeah. So profitability and growth, though, are typically at odds, aren't they?
Yeah,
Typically, if you're
yes, they
trying
are.
to get profitable, you need
Yeah,
to cut back on some of
yes.
the, growth initiatives, right? I mean, that's sort of actually what we've seen with Uber as a
Mhm.
company, pulling back internationally
Mhm.
in ride hail markets and selling off,
Yeah.
or, divesting unprofitable divisions, or, expensive divisions like ATG and, the trucking and things like that. So let's focus on profitability before we talk about growth. I mean, do you think that food delivery can be profitable going
Mhm.
forward in the future? And and if so, how do the companies get there? Because you said they're not
Yeah.
profitable right now.
Yeah. Um, I would say so. I think food delivery is in a very similar place to where ride hailing was a couple of years ago. If
Mm.
you remember the narrative, it was ride hailing could never be profitable. And I think
Yep.
what you've seen Uber show through their quarterly filings and annual filings is actually the ride business can be very profitable, right? And they even have some guidance and targets in terms of long-term EBITDA margins.
I mean, adjusted EBITDA, they were profitable before the pandemic on rides, right?
Yes, they were actually throwing off a lot of cash from the rideshare business, which was actually, to somewhat answer your question a little bit in terms of profitability versus growth. Typically, what you want to do is you want to have a core business or some kind of business that's generating cash that then is able to fund your next big project or your next big initiative. So ride hailing was essentially that for Eats. I do think the Eats business will be profitable. It will take a couple years. There's a couple things that need to happen or change. First of all, these platforms have been spending very aggressively on sales, marketing, and promotions. Everybody knows that. If you listen to the sort of quarterly analyst calls from Dar or other folks, you'll hear them talk about rationalization or competition. So the good news is over time, particularly as you have companies IPO and as you have less venture capital sort of flowing into the space, companies naturally just start to pull back on the spend.
Got it.
And so when
also
that happens,
consolidation, I assume, too, like with Postmates and Uber, or Just Eat, and, or DoorDash and Caviar too, right?
Exactly. And so we were, we probably had 6 or 7 players in the US about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Now we're effectively down to 3, which is Grubhub, Ubereats, and DoorDash. And so that helps quite a bit as well. And so I think you'll see a really big rationalization, and Dara has kind of alluded this this on calls, rationalization on sales and marketing. I think you'll see take rates on the restaurant side sort of organically go up. There's a lot of discounting that happens to when you're launching new markets. You kind of want to hook restaurants in.
Right.
And so organically, you'll probably see that a smidge for certain restaurants that have very heavy discounts. Not that common, but that it does happen from time to time. And then finally, I think you'll see more efficiency in the business. And so this is an interesting one because efficiency in the business is one way where you can drive profitability without really hurting growth. So if you pull back on, say, discounts, obviously there are some customers who will not order from you, right? But when I talk about efficiency, for example, let's just say, wrong orders or wrong items. When somebody gets an item that they weren't expecting, let's say I ordered a burger instead I got a hot dog. I'm just making that up as an example. If Uber or DoorDash and Grubhub can figure out how to even prevent that in the first place, that's money that the restaurant saves, that's money that the platform saves. And so there's all sorts of parts from an operational perspective where these platforms have been growing like wildfire over the past couple of years, but there's going to be a transition where they really start to think about almost like Amazon type of sort of seamlessness
like
or streamlining.
0.5% increase in efficiency.
Yeah, exactly. Just bips.
So are there any examples? I know you're on a roll, but are there any examples of like what are the low-hanging fruits when it comes to efficiency? I mean, we talked about, like I run my own business. I've got checklists for all my team. No one ever follows it, right? And then when you have turnover and you add to it, right? It's like it's easy. Like I, as a courier, I would never, go and pick up a burger and fries and not get a bunch of ketchup for the customer. But I mean, that happens all the time, right? And I think the challenge, the area where I really want to get your opinion is because, on an Uber ride, you're always going to get the person from point A to point B. You're going to get 100% of what you paid for. You're going to be at your final destination. Food delivery, that's not always, and maybe even, I don't know about, some or a majority or whatever percent of the time, that may not happen. Your food may arrive cold. It may be, like you didn't get a condiment. They may have added tomatoes and you didn't want onions or whatever it might be, right? And so the actual product that you're receiving is not what you are expecting. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I think there's, so a lot of these, what I'll call defects. So these are essentially, in operations, these are essentially preventable issues, things that really shouldn't have happened, in an ideal world. A lot of these defects happen on trip. So they're happening during the delivery itself. And there's typically 2 ways to solve this. One way is just through, operational processes. And so going back to your checklist is like the holy grail of an operational process. It's not a technology, it's a process, right? So there are some things we can solve through process. There's some things that we solve through technology. So I'll give you an example. So for example, when Uber started off, there wasn't always necessarily a ton of information for drivers in terms of, okay, where can you park the car maybe? So that's an easier process for you. The driver saves a bunch of time. The food is less likely to sit there cold, et cetera. And so you'll see this across platforms. They've been working on how do we improve the pickup experience for drivers through adding notes, for example. Maybe the
Yeah.
restaurant tells you, hey, I've actually got a secret parking spot in the back of my
Mm.
restaurant that you can use, and don't worry about it. We'll let you park there. You won't even get a ticket. So there's really small things from a technology perspective, and that's partly
Mm.
process as well, that these
Yeah.
platforms are really just grinding out so that they can shave off seconds, minutes, et cetera, and they can
Yeah.
shave off all of these defects.
And so I think it's really important point that you're making because as a courier, I could tell you on after my first delivery, delivering to some apartment complex, I'm here thinking, wow, it'd be really handy if I had a picture of, what the door looks like or
Yeah.
where to go or
Yeah.
some instructions for this person who's ordered 57 times on DoorDash or Ubereats, right? And I think it's important to note that these items, like it's not rocket science, like these items are on a product roadmap somewhere at all of these
Yes.
companies. It's just
Yeah.
that they're more focused on growth or they were more focused on growth. And now as they get into more of the profitability or efficiency phase, they're going to start knocking those out over the next 1, 2, 3 years.
Mhm. I think they've always been focused on this. Part of it is just
Okay.
experimentation. So the example that you just gave around,
Mm-hmm.
hey, it'd be great to have pictures. So we actually rolled that out in 2015, for example. So that's been around for a while. The reason you probably don't see it is because there's been a lot of experimentation, and actually showed it confused people a lot of the time.
Got it.
And so we ended up removing it. So going back to my point earlier around building this product and getting engineers to work on these things and really figuring out,
Yeah.
what works and doesn't work, that's just really tough, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
and sometimes
expensive
it
actually.
takes
Now that I think about it, right? Because what I want, maybe someone else doesn't want it, and
yes.
vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah. And even going back to the picture example, we actually had to have individuals go out and take a picture of everything individually,
Mhm.
right? And Uber has, 450,000 restaurants and
Yeah.
how many customers? So imagine doing that at scale, the army of people that you would need. So
Hmm.
a lot of these things they're working on, they're really tough problems because it's the
Yeah.
physical world and they're hard to scale. And so they're tough problems to solve for, but I'm really adamant, or I'm really optimistic that the platforms will over over time provide just a better and better
Yeah.
experience.
So just to be